Eugene Onegin is a novel in verse written by Alexander Pushkin. Onegin is considered a classic of Russian literature, and its eponymous protagonist has served as the model for a number of Russian literary heroes. It was published in serial form between 1825 and 1832. The first complete edition was published in 1833, and the currently accepted version is based on the 1837 publication. Almost the entire work is made up of 389 stanzas of iambic tetrameter with the unusual rhyme scheme abedefect, where the uppercase letters represent feminine rhymes while the lowercase letters represent masculine rhymes. This form has come to be known as the Onegin stanza, or the Pushkin sonnet. The innovative rhyme scheme, the natural tone and diction, and the economical transparency of presentation all demonstrate the virtuosity which has been instrumental in proclaiming Pushkin as the undisputed master of Russian poetry. The story is told by a narrator whose tone is educated, worldly, and intimate. The narrator digresses at times, usually to expand on aspects of the social and intellectual world. This allows for a development of the characters and emphasizes the drama of the plot despite its relative simplicity. The book is admired for the artfulness of its verse narrative as well as for its exploration of life, death, love, ennui, convention and passion. Main characters: Eugene Onegin, a dandy from St. Petersburg, about 25. An arrogant, selfish and world-weary cynic. Vladimir Lenski, a young poet, about 18. A very romantic and naive dreamer. Tatyana Larina, a shy and quiet, but passionate landowner's daughter. Pushkin referred to her as aged 17 in a letter to Pyotr Vyazemsky. Olga Larina, Tatyana's younger sister. Plot: in the 1820s, Eugene Onegin is a bored St. Petersburg dandy, whose life consists of balls, concerts, parties and nothing more. One day he inherits a landed estate from his uncle. When he moves to the country, he strikes up a friendship with his neighbor, a starry-eyed young poet named Vladimir Lenski. One day, Lenski takes Onegin to dine with the family of his fiancée at the sociable but rather thoughtless Olga Larina. At this meeting he also catches a glimpse of Olga's sister Tatyana, a quiet, precocious romantic and the exact opposite of Olga. Tatyana becomes intensely drawn to Onegin. Soon after, she bears her soul to Onegin in a letter professing her love. Contrary to her expectations, Onegin does not write back. When they meet in person, he rejects her advances politely but dismissively and condescendingly. This famous speech is often referred to as Onegin's sermon. He admits that the letter was touching, but says that he would quickly grow bored with marriage and can only offer Tatyana friendship. He coldly advises more emotional control in the future, lest another man take advantage of her innocence. Later, Lenski mischievously invites Onegin to Tatyana's name day celebration, promising a small gathering with just Tatyana, Olga, and the parents. When Onegin arrives, he finds instead a boisterous country ball, a rural parody of and contrast to the society balls of St. Petersburg he has grown tired of. Onegin is irritated with the guests who gossip about him and Tatyana, and with Lenski for persuading him to come. He decides to avenge himself by dancing and flirting with Olga. Olga is insensitive to her fiancé and apparently attracted to Onegin. Earnest and inexperienced, Lenski is wounded to the core and challenges Onegin to fight a duel. Onegin reluctantly accepts, feeling compelled by social convention. During the duel, Onegin unwillingly kills Lenski. Afterwards, he quits his country estate, traveling abroad to deaden his feelings of remorse. Tatyana visits Onegin's mansion, where she looks through his books and his notes in the margins, and begins to question whether Onegin's character is merely a collage of different literary heroes, and if there is, in fact, no real Onegin. Several years pass, and the scene shifts to St. Petersburg. Onegin has come to attend the most prominent balls and interact with the leaders of old Russian society. He sees the most beautiful woman, who captures the attention of all and is central to society's whirl, and he realizes that it is the same Tatyana whose love he had once turned away. Now she is married to an aged prince. Upon seeing Tatyana again, he becomes obsessed with winning her affection, despite the fact that she is married. However, his attempts are rebuffed. He writes her several letters but receives no reply. Eventually Onegin manages to see Tatyana and presents to her the opportunity to finally elope after they have become reacquainted. Does he desire her only for her wealth and position? She recalls the days when they might have been happy, but that time has passed. Onegin repeats his love for her. Faltering for a moment, she admits that she still loves him, but she will not allow him to ruin her and declares her determination to remain faithful to her husband. She leaves him regretting his bitter destiny. Major themes. One of the main themes of Eugene Onegin is the relationship between fiction and real life. People are often shaped by art, and the work is packed with allusions to other major literary works. Another major element is Pushkin's creation of a woman of intelligence and depth in Tatyana, whose vulnerable sincerity and openness on the subject of love has made her the heroine of countless Russian women, despite her apparent naivety. Pushkin, in the final chapter, fuses his muse and Tatyana's new form in society after a lengthy description of how she has guided him in his works. Perhaps the darkest theme, despite the light touch of the narration, is his presentation of the deadly inhumanity of social convention. Onegin is its bearer in this work. His induction into selfishness, vanity, and indifference occupies the introduction, and he is unable to escape it when he moves to the country. His inability to relate to the feelings of others and his frozen lack of empathy, the cruelty instilled in him by the world, is epitomized in the very first stanza of the first book by his stunningly self-centered thoughts about being with the dying uncle whose estate he is to inherit. But God, how deadly adult of sample sickroom attendants night and day, ... and sighing ask oneself all through, when will the devil come for you? Quote. However, the devil comes for Onegin when he literally kills the innocent and the sincere, shooting Lenski in the duel, and metaphorically kills innocence and sincerity when he rejects Tatyana. She learns her lesson, and armored against feelings and steeped in convention, she crushes his later sincerity and remorse. Tatyana's nightmare illustrates the concealed aggression of the whirl. She is chased over a frozen winter landscape by a terrifying bear and confronted by demons and goblins in a hut she hopes will provide shelter. This is contrasted to the open vitality of the real people at the country ball, giving dramatic emphasis to the war of warm human feelings with the chilling artificiality of society. So, Onegin has lost his love, killed his only friend, and found no satisfaction in his life. He is a victim of his own pride and selfishness. He is doomed to loneliness, and this is his tragedy. The conflict between art and life was no mere fiction in Russia. It is illustrated by Pushkin's own fate, his having been killed in a duel. He was driven to death, falling victim to the social conventions of Russian high society. Composition and publication. As with many other 19th-century novels, Onegin was written and published serially, with parts of each chapter often appearing published in magazines before the first printing of each chapter. Many changes, some small and some large, were made from the first appearance to the final edition during Pushkin's lifetime. The following dates mostly come from Nabokov's study of the photographs of Pushkin's drafts that were available at the time, as well as other people's work on the subject. The first stanza of Chapter 1 was started on May 9, 1823, and except for 3 stanzas, the chapter was finished on October 22. The remaining stanzas were completed and added to his notebook by the first week of October 1824. Chapter 1 was first published as a whole in a booklet on February 16, 1825, with a foreword which suggests that Pushkin had no clear plan on how he would continue the novel. Chapter 2 was started on October 22, 1823, and finished by December 8, except for stanzas XL and 35, which were added sometime over the next 3 months. The first separate edition of Chapter 2 appeared on October 20, 1826. Many events occurred which interrupted the writing of Chapter 3. In January 1824, Pushkin stopped work on Onegin to work on the Gypsies. Except for 25 stanzas, I-31 were added on September 25, 1824. Nabokov guesses that Tanya's letter was written in Odessa between February 8 and May 31, 1824. Pushkin incurred the displeasure of the Tsarist regime in Odessa and was restricted to his family estate Mihailovskoye in Pskov for 2 years. He left Odessa on July 21, 1824, and arrived on August 9. Writing resumed on September 5, and Chapter 3 was finished on October 2. The first separate publication of Chapter 3 was on October 10, 1827. Chapter 4 was started in October 1824. By the end of the year, Pushkin had written 23 stanzas and had reached 27 by January 5, 1825, at which point he started writing stanzas for Onegin's Journey and worked on other pieces of writing. He thought that it was finished on September 12, 1825, but later continued the process of rearranging, adding and omitting stanzas until the first week of 1826. The first separate edition of Chapter 4 appeared with Chapter 5 in a publication produced between January 31 and February 2, 1828. The writing of Chapter 5 began on January 4, 1826, and 24 stanzas were complete before the start of his trip to petition the Tsar for his freedom. He left for this trip on September 4 and returned on November 2, 1826. He completed the rest of the chapter in the week November 15 to 22, 1826. The first separate edition of Chapter 5 appeared with Chapter 4 in a publication produced between January 31 and February 2, 1828. When Nabokov carried out his study on the writing of Onegin, the manuscript of Chapter 6 was lost, but we know that Pushkin started Chapter 6 before finishing Chapter 5. Most of Chapter 6 appears to have been written before the beginning of December 19, 1826, when Pushkin returned to Moscow after exile in his family estate. Many stanzas appear to have been written between November 22 and 25, 1826. On March 23, 1828, the first separate edition of Chapter 6 was published. Pushkin started writing Chapter 7 in March 1827, but aborted his original plan for the plot of the chapter and started on a different tack, completing the chapter on November 4, 1828. The first separate edition of Chapter 7 was first printed on March 18, 1836. Pushkin intended to write a chapter called Onegin's Journey, which occurred between the events of Chapters 7 and 8, and in fact was supposed to be the 8th chapter. Fragments of this incomplete chapter were published, in the same way that parts of each chapter had been published in magazines before each chapter was first published in its first separate edition. When Pushkin first completed Chapter 8, he published it as the final chapter and included within its denouement on the line 9 cantos I have written, still intending to complete this missing chapter. When Pushkin finally decided to abandon this chapter, he removed parts of the ending to fit with the change. Chapter 8 was begun before December 24, 1829, while Pushkin was in Petersburg. In August 1830, he went to Boldino where, due to an epidemic of cholera, he was forced to stay for 3 months. During this time, he produced what Nabokov describes as an incredible number of masterpieces, and finished copying out Chapter 8 on September 25, 1830. During the summer of 1831, Pushkin revised and completed Chapter 8 apart from Onegin's letter, which was completed on October 5, 1831. The first separate edition of Chapter 8 appeared on January 10, 1832. Pushkin wrote at least 18 stanzas of a never-completed 10th chapter. It contained many satires and even direct criticism on contemporary Russian rulers, including the emperor himself. Afraid of being prosecuted for dissidence, Pushkin burnt most of the 10th chapter. Very little of it survived in Pushkin's notebooks. The first complete edition of the book was published in 1833. Slight corrections were made by Pushkin for the 1837 edition. The standard accepted text is based on the 1837 edition with a few changes due to the Tsar's censorship restored. The duel. In Pushkin's time, the early 19th century, duels were very strictly regulated. A second's primary duty was to prevent the duel from actually happening, and only when both combatants were unwilling to stand down were they to make sure that the duel proceeded according to formalized rules. A challenger's second should therefore always ask the challenged party if he wants to apologize for his actions that have led to the challenge. In Eugene Onegin, Lenski's second, Zaretsky does not ask Onegin even once if he would like to apologize, and because Onegin is not allowed to apologize on his own initiative, the duel takes place with fatal consequences. Zaretsky is described as classical and pedantic in duels, and this seems very out of character for a nobleman. Zaretsky's first chance to end the duel is when he delivers Lenski's written challenge to Onegin. Instead of asking Onegin if he would like to apologize, he apologizes for having much to do at home and leaves as soon as Onegin accepts the challenge. On the day of the duel, Zaretsky gets several more chances to prevent the duel from happening. Because dueling was forbidden in the Russian Empire, duels were always held at dawn. Zaretsky urges Lenski to get ready shortly after 6 o'clock in the morning, while the sun only rises at 20 past 8, because he expects Onegin to be on time. However, Onegin oversleeps, and arrives on the scene more than an hour late. According to the dueling codex, if a duelist arrives more than 15 minutes late, he automatically forfeits the duel. Lenski and Zaretsky have been waiting all that time, even though it was Zaretsky's duty to proclaim Lenski as winner and take him home. When Onegin finally arrives, Zaretsky is supposed to ask him a final time if he would like to apologize. Instead, Zaretsky is surprised by the apparent absence of Onegin's second. Onegin, against all rules, appoints his servant Gillet as his second, which was the last action to take from a nobleman. A blatant insult for the nobleman Zaretsky. Zaretsky angrily accepts Gillett as Onegin's second. By his actions, Zaretsky does not act as a nobleman should. In the end, Onegin wins the duel. Onegin himself, however, tried as he could to prevent the fatal outcome, and killed Lenski unwillingly and almost by accident. As the first shooter, he couldn't show that he was deliberately trying to miss the opponent, because this was considered as a serious insult and could create a formal reason to appoint another duel. Instead, he tried to minimize his chances by shooting without precise aiming, from the maximal possible distance, not even trying to come closer and get a clear shot. Translations. Translators of Eugene Onegin have all had to adopt a trade-off between precision and preservation of poetic imperatives. This particular challenge in the importance of Eugene Onegin in Russian literature have resulted in an impressive number of competing translations into English. Ante Nabokov, Walter W. Arndt's 1963 translation was written keeping to the strict rhyme scheme of the Onegin stanza and won the Bollingen Prize for translation. It is still considered one of the best translations. Vladimir Nabokov severely criticized Arndt's translation, as he had criticized many previous translations. Nabokov's main criticism of Arndt's and other translations is that they sacrificed literalness and exactness for the sake of preserving the melody and rhyme. Accordingly, in 1964 he published in 4 volumes his own translation, which conformed scrupulously to the sense while completely eschewing melody and rhyme. The first volume contains an introduction by Nabokov and the text of the translation. The introduction discusses the structure of the novel, the Onegin stanza in which it is written and Pushkin's opinion of Onegin, and gives a detailed account of both the time over which Pushkin wrote Onegin and the various forms any part of it appeared in publication before Pushkin's death. The second and third volume consists of very detailed and rigorous notes to the text. The fourth volume contains a facsimile of the 1837 edition. The discussion of the Onegin stanza contains the poem on translating Eugene Onegin, which first appeared in print in the New Yorker on January 8, 1955, and is written in 2 Onegin stanzas. The poem is reproduced both so that the reader of his translation would have some experience of this unique form, and also to act as a further defense of his decision to write his translation in prose. Nabokov's previously close friend Edmund Wilson reviewed Nabokov's translation in the New York Review of Books, which sparked an exchange of letters there and an enduring falling out between them. John Bailey has described Nabokov's commentary as by far the most erudite as well as the most fascinating commentary in English on Pushkin's poem, and as scrupulously accurate, in terms of grammar, sense and phrasing, as it is idiosyncratic and Nabokovian in its vocabulary. Some consider this Nabokovian vocabulary a failing, for it might require even educated speakers of English to reach for the dictionary on occasion. However, it is generally agreed that Nabokov's translation is extremely accurate. Other English translations. Babette Deutsch published a translation in 1935 preserving the Onegin stanzas. The Pushkin Press published a translation in 1937 by the Oxford scholar Oliver Elton, with illustrations by M.V. Dobujinski. In 1977, Charles Johnston published another translation trying to preserve the Onegin stanza, which is generally considered to surpass Arndt's. Johnston's translation is influenced by Nabokov. Vikram Seth's novel The Golden Gate was inspired by this translation. James E. Phelan published a translation in 1995 which was also influenced by Nabokov's translation, but preserved the Onegin stanzas. This translation is considered to be the most faithful one to Pushkin's spirit according to Russian critics and translators. Douglas Hofstadter published a translation in 1999, again preserving the Onegin stanzas. After having summarized the controversy in his book La Tombeau de Marot, Hofstadter's translation has a unique lexicon of both high and low register words, as well as unexpected and almost reaching rhymes that give the work a comedic flair. Tom Beck published a translation in 2004, preserving the Onegin stanzas. Wordsworth Classics of World Literature in 2005 published a translation by Roger Clark into English prose, seeking to retain the lyricism of Pushkin's Russian, perhaps the very best English translation. In April 2008, Henry M. Hoyt published through Dog-Ear Publishing a translation which preserves the meter of the Onegin stanza, but is unrhymed, his stated intention being to avoid the verbal changes forced by the invention of new rhymes in the target language while preserving the rhythm of the source. In September 2008, Stanley Mitchell, Emeritus Professor of Aesthetics at the University of Derby, published through Penguin Books a complete translation, again preserving the Onegin stanzas in English. There are a number of lesser-known English translations into other languages. French. There are at least 8 published French translations of Eugene Onegin. The most recent appeared in 2005. The translator, Andrei Markovich, respects Pushkin's original stanzas. Other translations include those of Paul Bay-Esau, Gaston Perrot, Nata Minor, Roger Legras, Maurice Collin, Michel Bayat and Jean-Louis Backers. As a 20-year-old, a former French president Jacques Chirac also wrote a translation, which was never published. German. There are at least a dozen published translations of Onegin in German. Carl Friedrich von der Borg, Eugenius Onegin, first part published in Der Refraktor. Ein Zentralblatt Deutschen Lebens in Russland, Dorpat, 1836 in 5 series, starting with the 14th issue on 1 August 1836, ending with the 18th issue on 29 August 1836. R. Lippert, Verlag von Wilhelm Engelmann, Leipzig 1840. Friedrich von Bodenstedt, Verlag der Decischen Geheimen Oberhauptdruckerei, Berlin 1854. Adolf Subert, Reklam, Leipzig 1872-73. Dr. Blumenthal, Moscow 1878. Dr. Alexis Lupus, Nur das One. Capital, Leipzig and St. Petersburg 1899. Theodor Kmitschauer, Verlag G. Müller, Munich and Leipzig 1916. Theodor Kmitschauer, Arthur Luther, 1923. Theodor Kmitschauer, Arthur Luther and Maximilian Schick, SWA Verlag, Leipzig and Berlin 1947. Elfriede Eckart Schalberg, Verlag Bühler, Baden-Baden 1947. Johannes von Günther, Reklam, Leipzig 1949. Theodor Kmitschauer and Konrad Schmidt, Weimar 1958. Theodor Kmitschauer and Martin Riemann, Reklam, Leipzig 1965. Manfred von der Ropp and Felix Zielinski, Winkler, Munich 1972. K. Borowski, Reklam, Stuttgart 1972. Rolf Dietrich Hill, Wilhelm Schmitz Verlag, Gießen 1980. Ulrich Busch, Mannes, Zurich 1981. Sabine Baumann and Metabiot von Christian Korner, Stromfeld, Frankfurt on the Main 2009. Italian. There are several Italian translations of Onegin. One of the earliest was published by G. Cassone in 1906. Ettore Lo Gatto translated the novel twice, in 1922 in prose and in 1950 in hendecasyllables. More recent translations are those by Giovanni Giudici and by Pia Pera. Hebrew Avraham Shlonsky, 1937. Avraham Levinson, 1937. Esperanto trans. Nikolai Nekrasov, published by Senachika Asocio Tutmonda, 1931. Spanish Eugene Onegin, novel in verse. Direct Spanish version, Russian original poetic form, notes and illustrations by Alberto Musso Nicolas.